topic today is ecological risk assessment and how it's applied. It can be applied in natural resource management, environmental policy, ecological policy, things like this. And in particular, I want to talk about its actual use, how it's oftentimes or sometimes is abused, and alternatives to using ecological risk assessment. Well, the focus here is on ecological risk assessment because risk assessment is used for lots of different things in policy making, decision making, management, and so on. And today specifically, we want to talk about exactly what is risk assessment and also what it is not, how it's used in our fields of natural resources and these kinds of areas, and also how it's abused when it's misused or inappropriately used in management or policy. Also, its future. What is the future of ecological risk assessment? Does it have a core feature of natural resource management, ecological policy, or is it going to be kind of a sidelight specialty activity? And what are the alternatives? There are many different ways to analyze data, information to help assist in decision making, and risk assessment is only one. First, though, a definition. Risk assessment is defined formally as an analytical procedure. That's all it is a particular procedure that evaluates the likelihood that an adverse event will occur. It's a relatively simple concept. It's a probability-based assessment, likelihood being the probability of this adverse. And by definition, to have risk assessment, the risk part of it means there must be something defined as an adverse event. When this is applied to the human condition, humans in terms of public health and individual health, adverse is relatively clear-cut. I mean, obviously dying is worse than being alive, and being sick is worse than being healthy. So adverse might seem relatively clear-cut. But when we deal with ecological issues, it's not quite so clear-cut. Well, ecological risk assessment, as a very special case of risk assessment, is the process that evaluates the likelihood, same definition, that adverse ecological event has occurred, may occur, or is the result of exposure to one or more stresses. And here is the first clue. Risk assessment applied to ecological system has its history in chemical exposures and chemical effects on ecosystems. So the key words in the ecological definition of risk assessment is it's a process as before, it's a likelihood as before, it's adverse, but it's adverse relative to an ecological condition or result. It also involves exposure, or at least it usually talks about exposure of stressors, and stressors are typically defined as chemicals or similar types of stresses that apply in the environment. Now, there are plenty of advocates for risk assessment, and this risk assessment really became popular in the ecological area in the 1980s. In the 1980s and through the 90s, there were a lot of different advocates for using risk assessment as a decision support tool. A lot of folks in Congress, at least their staffs, and they've resulted in bills being introduced to mandate the use of formal, statistically based risk assessment for public decision making of government agencies. There's also been a number of scientific recommendations coming from various commissions and policy groups composed of scientists recommending risk assessment as the tool of choice to help with decision making. Also, there's been a lot of political slogans and pushes to use risk assessment, the idea being it would bring some intellectual discipline to public policy making. So rather than just personal opinion, if you could introduce the statistically based risk assessment, you'd bring some discipline to how decisions are made. Also, there was a lot of view that from government agencies in terms of like the General Accounting Office, GAO reports recommended risk assessment along with some other tools to help bring discipline and transparency into government decision making. So rather than a personal opinion and just edicts, there would be some formality to the process. A lot of the times too, there's kind of the rationalist view around there. These environmental ecological issues tend to be complicated, so let the experts decide. One of the tools that experts use is risk assessment. And so if you let the scientists or let the technocrats make decisions, then as a result, you might use things like risk assessment. It's also a practical argument, is weighed because it's a practical way to attack a problem that really perhaps there are no alternatives. If you're talking about introducing a new chemical environment to solve a particular problem, there's going to be side effects. In other words, some adverse effects that no one really wants, but in order to get the good things, you're going to have some of the bad things. And so you're weighing basically the benefits against the risks. So in some sense, intellectually, there's really no alternative but to use a formal analysis about the benefits versus the risks. What about the critics? Well, risk assessment, like all techniques used in decision making and policy making and management, has opposing views. Some of the opposing views were brought up by detractors who argue that there's a lot of scientific uncertainty. These risk assessments are made on basically a few lab studies, a few species, a few target species. The data sets really are so unrealistic in terms of the real world. It's just not practical. In other words, you're taking and adding a degree of confidence, a degree of scientific certainty to issues that just don't have it. Also, there is an issue of triage because risk assessment can oftentimes results in issues that certain decisions just aren't economically or socially or viable. And so the counter argument to that is, well, there are certain types of decisions that are just legally or perhaps morally unacceptable. For example, driving species to extinction. Some would argue that driving species to extinction is just not acceptable no matter what the law says, no matter what decision support tools say. Another criticism is the process, like lots of these decision-making things, is controlled by the policy elite. And sometimes pejoratively, they're called the National Public Radio, NPR crowd, because the people, when you make policy decisions, a big element in policy decisions are people's values, the priorities they have. The analytical things like risk assessment can help decisions, but they just inform decisions. At the end of the day, people's values are the things that drive decision making. And people's values, if you follow the argument here with risk assessment, would be driven by the values of the scientists, the technical experts, the technocrats. And these are the folks who listen to NPR. As the saying goes, real people don't listen to NPR, they listen to something else. And technocrats, i.e. the policy elite, tend to listen to NPR. It's also manipulative because depending on what assumptions you want to make on risk assessment, you can pretty much come up with any answer you want. As the old saying goes, when a policymaker goes to a scientist and says, give me an analysis of this particular problem or this particular decision choice, the question the scientist, as the saying goes, will say, well, do you want a big number or do you want a small number? In other words, you can manipulate the procedures perfectly legally, but just based on your assumptions, you can come up with a decision support tool that tends to support the decision or ones that tends to undermine it. It's also, some people argue, an immoral tool because the result of risk assessment is that you look at the benefits of, say, introducing a particular, approving a particular chemical or pesticide for use, and you know based on risk numbers, dose response studies, that certain numbers of people will die. And so you basically weigh the risk of approving this chemical will mean probably that X number of people will die per million, a small number usually, but it'll be some. And so you've essentially identified that some number of people will die because you've approved this chemical. Now, it doesn't mean you should or should not approve the chemical, but it means it's not free. There are costs to it. And the costs in some of these cases are human lives or human well-being. Nothing surprising about that, but some would argue that's essentially premeditated murder. The only difference is you don't know which individuals will die because of this decision. Well, how is risk assessment used in practice in kind of the real world out there? Well, risk assessment is a widely used approach to inform decision making. Now, I use the word inform here carefully because I don't mean to influence decision making. In other words, it doesn't tend to push decisions a certain way, but it just provides a useful input, in theory at least, to decision makers. So risk assessment is widely used. We use it ourselves in everyday decisions we make when we get in a car. There's a certain risk of driving, crashes, and so forth, but there's benefits. And so we essentially make a risk assessment. For what I'm going to get out of this, it's probably worthwhile to take the risk. There's also groups like a lot of organizations, universities, government agencies, and others have something equivalent to an Office of Risk Management, which just go around and look for issues that are so-called adverse events and figure out the probability of those and how to basically manage to minimize those probabilities. So risk assessment is common in organizations both public and private. It's used obviously in the whole insurance field, life insurance, automobile, health insurance. People, they're risk appraisers or risk assessors who will figure out the probability of these adverse events happening. And of course, if the adverse events happen, then the insurance company has to pay. And if you don't have good estimates of those adverse events, you will go bankrupt soon. It's also used a lot in environmental risk to human health. Lots of different things that the public policy decisions that are made will assess the risk of this particular choice to human health. And very, very commonly is the risk of chemicals to biota, ecological risk assessment. In other words, if a particular chemical is approved for use or is approved for manufacturing use and so forth, what are the risks to the biota? This is the ecological risk assessment that's extremely common. Is it helpful to decision makers when you deal with these complicated issues, risk assessment? It's not entirely clear. Risk assessment is really designed for relatively narrow, focused, simple, clear-cut issues. And so when you get into bigger ecological risk assessments, which are the most of them, the majority of them, the question is really, is it very useful? Well, here are some typical examples of complicated or complex ecological policy problems, and these aren't unusual. This is pretty typical of what an average person in the field would work with. For example, the cumulative effects of chemicals. Assessing the effect of an individual chemical holding everything else equal was relatively straightforward to assess. When you have multiple exposures to chemical, it's much, much more difficult. So how accurate of the real world are these risk assessments when they involved cumulative effects or collective effects? Land use alteration development. A lot of ecological risk problems and issues are driven by changes to the landscape, human changes to the landscape, or so-called development. These aren't exactly amenable to assessing risk because obviously changing the landscape changes lots of things. Some changes you might arbitrarily call beneficial, others you might call adverse. It depends on how you're going to define the risk as a benefit or which change you're going to define as a cost. And there's issues like invasive, exotic, introduced, non-native species. These can be good or bad depending on how you look at it. So they're not all species are uniformly, by scientifically at least, not adverse. They may be beneficial depending on what's important to you. And changes in biological diversity. There's nothing in science that says biological diversity is a critical thing to be protected. Certainly biological diversity is important, and changes in biological diversity may be good or bad depending on what society is trying to accomplish with a piece of land. But changes in biological diversity are very, very difficult to assess using a risk framework. Climate change. Climate changes for lots of reasons, historically over millennia and longer. So changing climate isn't unusual. Now the human effect on climate change, which is the big topic these days, is another issue that's difficult to assess the risk of this because some changes in climate are going to be beneficial for certain features, other changes in climate are going to be adverse depending on what's important to humans. Well, as a first step in ecological risk assessment, you need to define the policy problem. Risk assessment, the concept of risk is not a given. You have to apply it in ways to your particular problem. Well, what is the policy or risk problem? What exactly is it? Not sometimes as simple as we might think. For example, let's look at the Columbia salmon issue. Salmon in the Columbia have been declining for 150 years. And you might think it would be a relatively simple situation. You've got salmon runs out there in the Columbia River in Oregon, Washington, Idaho, British Columbia, and they're declining. And we know why they're declining. There's no shortage of science here. They're declining because of land use changes, heavy logging, the transport of timber and so forth. These were particularly big changes back in the 1800s, late 1800s, early 1900s. We also concurrently have issues like irrigation, dam construction, many dams on the Columbia main stem, the tributary dams, irrigation, taking water out for agriculture and so forth. These dams have made major alterations, not only blocked a lot of salmon runs, but they've altered the flow of water. So the Columbia tends to be a relatively even flowing river through the year, whereas historically you had tremendous spring runoffs, the so-called freshets, that really would be oftentimes be floods, but would be a very, very different hydrological dynamic than you have now. And you also have issues of floods themselves. Floods themselves occur less common now than they did, say, pre-dam era, but they definitely occur, and more would occur in the absence of dams. And so how do flood change things? From a salmon perspective, floods are great. This basically replenishes a lot of things. It's a good situation. A lot of times they happen in the spring, which tends to wash a lot of salmon down to the sea. But from a human standpoint, most people think floods are not a good thing. And we also have the infrastructure that's been built up in the Pacific Northwest in the last 150 years, particularly things like agriculture. Some of this agriculture is irrigated agriculture, and taking water out of rivers is not good from a salmon standpoint, but it's great for agriculture. So there's a trade-off there. And then, of course, we have issues with the salmon themselves. They're fished both commercially, recreationally, and from various Indian tribes. And so heavy harvest, particularly in the past, the pre-1920s, did a real number on salmon runs, and it's very difficult for them to come back after those heavy fishing pressures, because the habitat is either A, not there at all, it's been altered, or B, it's blocked because of dams. And so the Columbia situation is a good example of how do you define the risk problem, exactly what it is. Society might say, well, it's declining salmon, but there are literally dozens of possible causes. So to come up with a relatively simple description using the risk paradigm is extremely difficult. And you might simplify the problem down to a very narrow thing, say an irrigated watershed in this particular location, but that's not very realistic, because that's a very, very small part of the overall issue. So risk assessment for these complicated problems has proved out not to be very useful. Well, formulating the policy risk problem, how does it actually work in practice? In the real world, how does this formulation work out? First of all, the first and most crucial step is it requires application of policy preferences. There's nothing in science that says a change in an ecosystem is inherently good or bad. It's just different. It's a change. So one person might look at an ecological change and say, this is great. We basically create a lot of irrigated farmland. This is fabulous. The same person would say, this destroyed a lot of salmon habitat. There's no right or wrong here. They're just different preference. So the first step right off the bat, there needs to be an explicit statement of which policy preferences, and policy preferences come from people, are going to carry the day. This is a challenging question, because what exactly is an adverse event? Science will not help you with that answer. Only policy preferences will. Often the mandate is couched in a legal mandate. But then again, the question is, for example, using the Endangered Species Act has some very, very explicit mandates in there. But are those really what society wants to apply in a particular case? Now, there's a tendency of technocrats versus policymakers. Technocrats tend to want to narrow a problem. Policymakers want to keep the problem broad the way it really is. And of course, there's a problem with that. And the basic problem is narrow, tractable, but politically irrelevant problems are what technocrats, scientists, tend to like to work on. They're narrow and tractable. What that means is they're problems that they can come up with some data that stands up to scrutiny. But policymakers say that's not the real world. The real world is, I have these broad, intractable, but policy-relevant problems, like the salmon one, and unless you can give me some information applying to this broad problem, this little narrow focused science here is not going to do me a lot of good. Well, how about assessing risk as a practical matter? First of all, keep in mind that assessment and management are very different things. Risk assessors measure the probability of an adverse event occurring. Management decides if that occurrence is acceptable or not and trades it off against the benefits. That's not an assessment issue. So risk managers are very different folks than risk assessors. These are two totally different people. It's a classic issue between a scientist and a decision maker. Scientists provide input to the decision-making process. Managers, policymakers make decisions. Very, very different roles. You also need to have some consensus on the identifying the burden of proof. Who assumes it? Do you make the assumption that a adverse event is, unless you can prove that a chemical or a stressor or some change will not adversely harm the environment, whatever that means, we're not going to approve it? The burden of proof is critical, and that is not for scientists to decide. That's for policymakers and more broadly the public to decide. Do you take an extremely conservative decision-making approach like a precautionary principle, which is perfectly fine, but it basically says you've got to prove that something will not have an adverse effect until we're going to approve it. It sounds good in practice, it sounds good in theory, but in practice it doesn't work very well. And defining the risk options, the decision options. Who decides these? Is it the technical people, the risk manager, the public? In some broader sense, these are really public policy choices. They're things where risk assessors can provide relatively limited input, technical input, but ultimately others decide. The best science. Well, what defines the best science? People caustically sometimes say, well, the best science is my science, what my group supports. Junk science is your science, what you support. So best science is not as simple and straightforward. Most people say it has to be peer-reviewed, but peer-reviewed is uneven. There's some journals that have very rigorous peer review. There's others that are, quote, peer-reviewed, but as studies have shown, almost anything can get published in those. Who decides that and who enforces it? How about assessment independence? Risk assessors is really a technical activity, but there's a lot of assumptions that have to be made. So who assures that the risk assessors are really independent, or are they under the thumb, if you will, of decision makers, politicians, or other people? This is a real problem out there, the independence of risk assessors, and can we really count on their technical assessments as being fair and even-handed? And then we have displacement behavior. This happens a lot, and sometimes politicians and decision makers for unpopular choices will say, well, I didn't really want to make this tough choices where the losers are pretty unhappy, but the scientists, the technical experts, the risk assessors told me I had to make this decision. Well, that's not true. Risk assessment information is just one of many inputs into decision making. But especially if you're up for re-election, it's very easy to stand behind the scientists, the risk assessors, and say, well, these folks over here made me make this choice, even though I don't want to do it. Well, what technical tools are available in risk assessment? The tools commonly used in risk assessment are bioassays, and these are historically been the most common. You basically put an animal, usually a fish or some other aquatic organism, in an aquarium or some kind of a small container, and you apply the stressor under concern, the chemical under concern. And these are surrogates for what? I mean, obviously fish don't live in a little pond, a little aquarium. They live in the real world. So you've got to make the assumption that what you find in a laboratory can be extrapolated to the real world with all the other confounding interactions going on. Field research is realistic. It's much better because that's the real world out there, if you will. But how rigorous can you make these studies? You can't really get paired comparisons like you can in a laboratory. But the trade-off is it's realistic, but you can't get replicates easily. It's very expensive, very time-consuming, and you can't isolate the competing stressors, the competing effects out there, or the competing things that are causing problems or potentially causing problems. And then we have the broad issue of environmental impact analysis, but a lot of that kind of work has essentially become an issue of process, not substance, because environmental impact statements, tend to be these massive documents that one copy of it takes 5,000 pages or some ridiculous amount. No one ever reads these things, and so they really don't have much influence on the process. They almost become surrogates. See, we spent all the money, we did all the research, we did all this. We couldn't come up with any really bad effects, and so we want to approve it. Or look at all the bad effects in here, we don't want to approve it. So environmental impact analysis and assessments really haven't proved out to be as useful as many people thought early on. And then we have the broad area of modeling, computer simulation, very, very common these days. And there's issues here, of course, too, even though you can conceivably every piece of information you ever know about a topic you can cover and put into a model. These are tools, they're not answers. They will give you assessments of if you did this, here are the likely consequence. But they're only as good as not only the data you put in, but they're also only as good as your understanding of the ecosystem. And ecosystems are extremely complicated, and a lot of conditions that you are interested in have never occurred before. And so it's hard to predict how the system will respond to a particular proposed change. And expert scientific judgment. We have lots of experts out there. The problem that's occurred here, and of course this, like all these tools, has its use, no question about it. But a lot of these issues are extremely complicated. When you go to scientific experts, they're going to base these on their opinions, and they're perfectly reasonable. But they're not things that you really want to make major, massive decisions based on. One or two people's decisions. You don't one really understands them, and you don't have any idea if they can be replicated or not. And of course, most critically is individual and societal preferences drive these choices. You know, the science aspect, the risk assessment aspect is only one piece of the decision environment. And it's really people's choices, preferences, either individually or societally, collectively, that drive it. And of course, with legislation the way it's been the last 50 or 60 years, many of these things, or most of them perhaps, if they're important, end up in court. So they tend to be duked out, if you will, in a courtroom setting, which is a very different environment than typically you find within government or within the scientific community. And then we have issues like adaptive decision analysis, adaptive management. These are ones in theory where you make a little choice and then see what happens and make another choice, sometimes called decision making by muddling through. This works pretty well, except there are many issues out there where people don't want you to make choices. For example, if you're talking about the possibility of either, say, constructing a dam or building a dam or taking a dam out, there's no easy way to make little changes. You either build a dam or you don't. And so this works maybe on a few simple cases, but on the big cases, the big policy issues that we're faced with, it's not turned out to be so useful. Well, in fact, let's get to the core of this issue. Is science itself, scientific information, really limiting in ecological policymaking? I mean, we've talked about it a lot here today, but in fact, is it really that critical in many of these case studies? It's really, I think, an issue of clashes over values and science. And you hear things like this: if we only had more scientific information, we could solve this contentious policy debate. That has not been my experience. My experience is these issues, no matter how much science you have, whether they're climate change, wildfire policy, bringing back wild salmon, or any of these issues, it's not a situation where more salmon is going to make this problem go away. In fact, if anything, it just perpetuates the conflict, because the conflict is really driven by people's preferences, people's values, not lack of science. Another statement, I've heard permutations of this: we need to use science to solve this problem, not the politics of special interests. And of course, what do we mean by special interest? In the political environment, special interest is your interest. My interest is in the public interest. And of course, by definition, everybody else's interest is of less importance than yours as an advocate. So science will not solve this problem. Science might help solve this problem, but it's not going to solve this problem. Ultimately, it's a clash of competing values. Another one you hear very common in the scientific world is we should let scientists tell us what to do. After all, they are the ones that understand the issues. And a lot of politicians say the same thing. You hear this all the time. We're going to make science-based decisions. Let scientists tell us what we need to do. Well, wait a second. Most decisions are driven largely by competing values. So are you going to use the values of science to make these policy calls? I don't think so. What people really mean is we're going to use science to help inform, but at the end of the day, it's going to be somebody's values that pick the decision that we're going to go forth with. Another thing that I hear often, or have heard often in my experience, is from politicians usually: when will you scientists have enough information to tell us what we should do? We being policymakers, elected officials, congressmen, presidents, governors, others. When will you have enough information to tell us what to do? We will never have enough information, because we're not the information source for the things that are really important. Ultimately, you, decision makers, have to pick the winners and losers. That's what policymaking is all about. Science can help you make that, inform you a little better to make that decision, But at the end of the day, policymakers make the choices. Policymakers pick the winners and losers, and that is always, by definition, contentious. And also, in my experience, scientific information is rarely limited in ecological policy making. For example, in the salmon issue that I use as an example, we know more about this group of fish than any other group of fishes in the world. And if we don't know enough about this fish, we'll never know enough about any of the others. And so it's not scientific information or lack of it that's limiting decision making. These choices are tough. No matter which choice is made, there are going to be big losers and big winners. And trust me, the losers know they're going to be losers, and they'll fight vigorously to avoid that particular policy choice from being adopted. Another statement I hear a lot is science debates in policy are often a symptom of decision avoidance. And that is true in my experience. And that is a lot of times we debate science ad nauseum, and you get deeper into it and do a deconstruction of the case study and find out it's really not the issue. It's really competing values. But it's easier, more intellectually rewarding to debate science rather than values. Because in values, everybody's values are equal politically. Whereas some science is right and wrong, and there's better and worse science. And so we debate that as a surrogate for debating people's values. Well, challenges for scientists and others for the proper use of risk assessment, for scientists especially, be policy relevant, aggressively pursue neutral. Be relevant because most science is irrelevant for a decision problem, a risk problem. And also be aggressively policy neutral. Don't have a dog in a fight. Don't try to convince the policymaker that the policymaker ought to adopt a particular policy option. Establish linkages between biological and social sciences. Biological, the physical sciences, so-called hard sciences, are just one input. Social sciences, understanding human behavior, is very, very important in policy making. Educate the public about the proper role of science. A lot of people in the public, I think, just think scientists make these decisions. No, scientists don't. They provide information to policymakers, decision makers, elected officials, and others, and those people weigh all the competing aspects to make a decision. The decision-making process is, in fact, not oftentimes democratic, and that is, technocrats, the policy elite, tend to make decisions behind a facade of technical decision-making like risk assessment. So I would always argue is be clear. What is a value choice and what is scientific information? And value choices are the democratic process. Scientific information comes from scientific experts, and it doesn't matter what people think is true, it's true or it's not. That's not true about values. Values are equal in a sense of a policy arena. Avoid scientific hubris. That is, we have scientists oftentimes every few generations, every few years will come up with some great solution to a technical problem, where wildfire, climate change, salmon decline, you name it. There's a poor track record for all these great breakthroughs. Anytime you think somebody's got a solution, a magical solution to a policy problem, is be skeptical. So avoid scientific or technical hubris. These issues are innately complicated, and they're not going to be solved by some miraculous breakthrough in science. There are alternatives to ecological risk assessment. Well, let's look at some of those alternatives. First, just avoid formal analysis. Provide information if you're a scientist. Provide information in a blunt, understandable, clear way, a narrative way. Don't go into these formulations like risk assessment. They tend to confuse decision makers. So avoid formal analysis, including risk assessment. Eliminate the concept of risk. After all, what is an adverse event? Although I suspect now in the political process it would be very difficult to get the idea of risk assessment out of the decision-making world, because risk assessment has been built in. And it works pretty well for human health issues, but doesn't work well for ecological issues. Move into something like ecological change, which is more scientifically based, because any ecological change can be either good or bad, adverse or benign, unless you apply a value judgment. So avoid the concept of risk as a political construct. Just focus on ecological change. If you select option 1, here are the changes that will occur. If you select option 2, here are a different set of changes that will occur. Redefine terms. This is an issue that tend to mask real differences. We can get involved in debates about semantics and risk assessment, dynamic, statistically based risk assessment, very complicated ideas. The concepts are simple, but the nomenclature, the semantics, are very, very difficult to penetrate, and the public just throws up their hands, or decision makers even throw up their hands and say, I have no idea what you're talking about, but it sounds impressive, so I'll just defer. And move into something like ecological consequence analysis. This has also been proposed by a number of people. Get rid of the concept of risk and just say, hey, ecological analysts cannot give you good or bad. They can just say, here are the consequences of a particular choice. Option A will have these consequences, option B will have these, and so forth. A few take-home messages. First, when you deal with ecological risk assessment, it is useful, but it's no panacea. It may help you, but it's not going to be the great solution that early on people thought it might be. Appropriate use, it's okay for simple problems, simple policy problems, little chemical problems, little dose response, toxicity problems, it's worked fine for those. When you get outside those simple problems, get into more complicated real world problems, it's broken down. As a technical tool, has it really become still a technical tool, or has it become political rhetoric? As politicians a lot of time talk about managing risk and so forth, but they are not really explicit. They're never really clear that, hey, wait a second, I've got to make a choice of what an adverse event is. The public doesn't pick up on it. So it's no longer a technical tool, it's almost an advocacy tool. Science. Keep in mind that science is only one input into decision making, and arguably not even the most important input. So while science is useful, essential, necessary, it's not the driving factor behind decision making. Straight talk. There's no substitute for straight talk. Risk assessors, scientists, and others ought to be sure that they convey information in a way that's not only clearly understood, it's potentially useful to decision makers. It's blunt, to the point, clear-cut. Uncertainty is clearly stated, and there's some sense of how confident you are in the answers or information that you're providing. Remember the first principles. Remember the tyranny of reductionism, and that is the problems that scientists feel most comfortable with, they can do scientifically, are usually the ones that policymakers will say the result is largely irrelevant to what I'm dealing with. The future of ecological policy. Remember, the key thing that you have as a technical tool, use common sense. There's nothing that will substitute for common sense in terms of policy analysis, risk assessment, or any other kinds of assessment. Welcome to the world of policy analysis, policy making, and risk assessment. Thank you.